Hi. As a teenager, I spend a lot of time on the internet. I'm always watching YouTube or scrolling through Instagram or Reddit. So I'm always taking in huge amounts of information without even realizing it, really. So when I stumbled across this video of Greta Thunberg, I was absolutely hooked.
My message is that we'll be watching you. This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?
All right, so by a show of hands, how many of you have heard of Greta Thunberg before? Ooh, okay. How many of you have seen this video before? Okay, so like the same number of people. Okay, so when I first saw it, I had to figure out what was going on, who she was, and what she was fighting for. I did my research, and I was really impressed. For those of you who don't know, which seems like a very small fraction, she's a 16-year-old Swedish climate change activist. And honestly, she's probably done more than me, you, and everyone else in this room combined. So let me explain why. At 15, she started skipping school, not to play hooky or eat some Swedish fish, but to advocate for climate change outside of the Swedish parliament. I'm not going to read what that says because I don't want to offend a whole nationality of people who are taller than me, but it vaguely translates to school strike for climate. In 2018, she addressed the United Nations Climate Change Conference. Can you imagine that? A 15-year-old addressing a UN conference. When I was 15, I was struggling with IGCSE French, and I was happy that I got 20 minutes of playtime on the basketball team. Meanwhile, Greta Thunberg is literally saving the world. 2019 was and still is the year of Greta. In May, she was put on the front cover of Times Magazine and was called a next generation leader. She had a Vice documentary made about her called Make the World Greta Again, which is a fantastic pun, by the way. She received a fellowship from the Royal Scottish Geographical Society. Times Magazine named her as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. And if that's not enough for you, she was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. She didn't end up winning it. The results came out yesterday. But you know who else has won a Nobel Peace Prize? Martin Luther King Jr., Theodore Roosevelt, Barack Obama, Mikhail Gorbachev, huge names that everyone knows. So, after figuring out all of this about a 16-year-old Swedish girl with Asperger's syndrome, I wanted to know why climate change action wasn't at the pace it really should be at. Now, I took AP Psychology for like a month, so I'm not an expert on this by any means, but I've always been really passionate about biology and psychology. Learning how we work as individuals and how we work in a society has always fascinated me. So, I started looking into the psychological basis behind our inaction and our general reluctance to do something. So before I keep on going, how many of you know that climate change is a real issue that we have to deal with every day? Okay. Now how many of you have actually done something about it? Okay, so like half of you. That's where the issue is. We're not doing anything about it, but we all know about it. We know that life we know it is coming to an end, that carbon dioxide levels are rising, that we need to clean up the gigatons of waste that we're producing, yet we do nothing. Why? Well, it's actually a pretty easy question to answer. First, I'd like to introduce you to the doom barrier effect. We're constantly berated, day in and day out, that we're going to enter a boiling hot Earth, that Earth is going to become a living hellhole, that there are going to be massive forest fires and unimaginable floods. And Instagram posts and Facebook constantly tell us that if we don't do anything, we're all going to die, that life as we know it is going to cease to exist. And while they're not wrong, it's really ineffective and counterintuitive. Let me tell you why. So, The doom barrier effect, proposed by Per Espen-Stokes, proposes that we've become desensitized to warnings about climate change. As a result, we start to ignore the speakers, videos, and announcements that fight for change. They've got good intentions, sure, but we begin to stereotype speakers and activists. We start to avoid everything that has to do with them. We become emotionally numb. So think of it like veganism, okay? Great concept on its surface. It's fantastic for us, fantastic for the environment, and it's definitely a step in the right direction. Except the vying of veganism for a choice people, or for a choice certain people, leads to the stereotyping of all vegans as overbearing and kind of annoying. And no offense to them, but I feel like that's what the general perception is, even if the concept itself is virtuous. The reason behind this is that humans tend to avoid what we don't like. The pleasure principle basically states that we like to do what we want to do, and we like to avoid what we don't like to do. If you think about a simple example of a kid doing his or her chores, they're not going to want to do it. They're going to find a way to get around it. I remember one time when I was 6 years old, I used to take Taekwondo lessons. You know, every single time before class, our instructor would make us stretch. Every single time, which is great for us, right? It loosens up our body, improves our flexibility, makes sure that we don't get injured. Except I hated stretching. I had so much energy as a little kid that I absolutely hated just standing in place doing this for like 20 minutes. So eventually I wanted to stop going to Taekwondo, and I did. In a time like that, quitting wasn't smart. In a time like this, quitting still isn't smart. So I'm hoping that most of you, if not all of you, are smarter than I was when I was 6 years old. Otherwise, it's kind of an issue. We have to get through the bad to get to the good. There's another reason why we're ignoring climate change. You can't really see it unless you think about it. Once again, I'm not a psychologist, but I call this the ignorance of the impossible. And honestly, after naming essay after essay, I just wanted to name something else, so I went with this. Climate change is often portrayed as this huge, unimaginably catastrophic event. But we can't imagine that. We can't understand that. We can't imagine that one day there won't be food left on shelves because the climate isn't fit for agriculture anymore. We can't imagine the unbearable heat we'll have to experience. We can't imagine the fact that water levels will rise, submerging entire cities. We can't imagine that there might not be a generation after mine. And that's where the issue is. We can't imagine it. We can't understand it. So, as an example, I'm sure all of you have thought about what the afterlife is like. Typically, this is pretty well tied in with your religion or your culture or things you learn in school. You either go to heaven or hell, you're sent to Valhalla, you're reincarnated. There's always some twist on it. Okay, so Prakar, for example, what do you think the afterlife is like?
Simulated utopia?
Never mind, that was a bad question to ask. Dr. Tuhar, what do you think the afterlife is like? Okay, well that's it. Okay, I'll take that answer. So for the rest of us, like for me especially, I think reincarnation is definitely what's going to happen to me. There's nothing, there has to be something after, right? That's what I think. But imagine nothing. Imagine absolutely nothing at all. No feelings, no emotions, no senses, no touch, no taste, no nothing. It's hard to imagine. And that's why a lot of people decide not to think of it this way, except for Dr. Tuhar. So, something that makes this even worse is that scientists like to use big numbers and complex graphs that we can't understand. There's a language gap between the terminology they use and the terminology we use. I can't understand this graph, and I made this presentation. So that seems like an issue to me. The fact that climate change and its effects are so abstract in nature, and the language that is used typically doesn't make sense to us, makes it so that we don't really know what's going on. We're putting psychological distance between us and climate change. And honestly, that's a pretty big issue when we, the people, are the ones who have to make change. Sure, we can let politicians and scientists and 16-year-old girls decide what the future of the Earth is. But at the end of the day, it's us. It is the people who will make change. If you look around us, the world is changing. Every community, every country, every state, every city, every town, everything is connected and everything is changing. So for me, the monsoon season this year has been the worst I've ever experienced, that I've ever thought of. I had a basketball tournament in Pune recently, a couple of weeks ago, and the rains there were so bad that 17 people died in 24 hours. There were 4 teams of 10 teenagers there. We were terrified. We didn't know what was going to happen. Throughout the entirety of the monsoon season, 2,400 people died this year. And if that's not something that really gets to you, I don't know what will. There are tangible effects of climate change if you open your eyes. Great, awesome. What's next? How do we beat these psychological barriers? This brings me to my third and final point. Like deer in headlights, we freeze in the face of danger and fear. This quote by Psychology Today basically says that in order to fix the fact that we get stuck in place, that we're stuck in a mindset that, you know what, there's no point, there's nothing to do. The way that we beat that is by implementing small changes. For example, my mom and I, we've been using cloth bags every single time we go to the grocery store since we've been in India. That's for 4 years. We go grocery shopping every 2 weeks. We use 2 to 3 bags. That's 312 bags in total, let's say. Okay? Each plastic bag would be 30 to 40 grams. Doing the math on that, that's 11 kgs of plastic saved. What's worse is that that's 66 kilograms of CO2 saved. That is more than I weigh in carbon dioxide. We also started making little composting bins using muesli dabbas. So you guys don't really have any reason not to do this. It's pretty easy. So humans are pack creatures. We all live in communities. I know that some of you might be thinking, you know what? I'm one person in 7.7 billion. What I do obviously doesn't matter, right? Except for the fact that there's, I want to say, at least 2 people, at least 10 people, at least 40 people in this room. If we're pack animals, we're going to be looking at what other people do. We're really, really good at looking at what other people do. In a society, we figure out what's right and wrong based on the actions of others. Following the norm is something humans are great at. It's a heuristic we use all the time. Studies show that if I put solar panels on my roof, you're more inclined to do so as well. If I start recycling, buying local fruits and vegetables, you're more inclined to do so as well. And through that, you'll figure out what we really need to do. What are the changes we need to make? I know you've heard it a million times. We need to make change. We've seen the impacts of climate change. There's no point in running anymore. Here in our communities and households, we've seen the impacts. In Chennai, people wanted rain. In Mumbai, people couldn't get enough of it. The wildfire in the Amazon was catastrophist. I'm sure most of you guys remember how Instagram was absolutely flooded by the posts about the Amazon. It was everywhere. Now, here's something other people advocating for this cause won't say. The world won't end in 2030. It won't end in 2050, or whatever else social media has led us to believe. No, the world probably won't be uninhabitable by the time that I have kids. No, we're not completely doomed if we don't fix climate change in the next couple months. But it'll certainly be different. Scientists are constantly developing ways to grow crops in drier conditions. That's what ICRISAT does. Scientists are developing more efficient uses of water. Remember those vegans I was talking about earlier? Plant-based meat alternatives are taking the world by storm. I tried the Impossible Burger over the summer, and it tastes exactly like beef. It's really good. We're prepping my generation and the next generation for the changing world. Our actions matter, not just for us, but for our kids, and for their kids. Before I go, I want to leave you with one more thought experiment. Imagine 40 years from now, you've got kids, or grandkids for some of you. Imagine they walk up to you and they ask, why didn't you do anything? Why didn't you take action against climate change? Why do I have to deal with it now? And why would you do this to us? How many of you could bear the guilt of that 40 years from now when your kids or grandkids have to face you and say that to you? Take change now. That's what's important. Thank you.